we're done with the best, now we're on to the worst. And it's gonna be 7 picks. The reason why is because I couldn't find 3 more that could make the candidate, but I have picked out 7 bosses that I personally don't like. Whether it's due to the fights themselves being not fun, gimmicks not being really that good, the fight itself not being really challenging, or just downright irritating, or the characters themselves not being interesting as villains and such. There are many factors on judging whether these bosses are terrible, but for me personally, this was a bit tricky, but keep in mind, these are the ones that I really didn't care for from the series itself, because as good as the series is, there's always going to be a few duds here and there. So let's not waste any more time and get into my picks on the worst of the lot.
Yeah, well, if there's anything like the rest of you, I think I'll manage.
I have mentioned in the best list that Sly 2 has the worst lineup of bosses in the series, and the fights do kinda exist, but there's only 2 bosses from the game I actually didn't enjoy, and one of those being the encounters against Neela during the train segment. So, what's the deal with these fights? Well, not a whole lot, because they're just bullet hell encounters. Both encounters are pretty easy and feel more like the mini-boss standout, which kinda makes sense since this feels like a mini-boss. But the fight itself isn't even really that fun or exciting since you're just gunning her down with the little RC chopper while she sends out barrages of BS at you, mostly in the second encounter where it gets really annoying to try to avoid a bunch of projectiles, enemies, and missiles all around. These fights just really feel stale and aren't really that fun in my opinion, but it is pretty low because there's just not a whole lot to say in terms of being one of the worst, but it's definitely one of the weaker bosses I didn't have any fun looking forward to, especially replaying Sly 2.
Yeah, well, if there's anything like the rest of you, I think I'll manage.
So I've mentioned in the best list again that the pirate episode is my least favorite from Sly 3 and how much I hate it. Well, guess what? Captain with Lee further proves the point of why I hate this chapter. Aside from the chapter itself being a complete annoyance, how does the captain end off? Well, it's just a sword duel, which you think would be really exciting, but it really isn't. You have to get the pattern of Captain Woofley to avoid his attacks and then smack him when he does his little taunting, either the head or in the body. Since he has no health bar, you have to push him off in order to actually win. Seems simple, right? Well, it's really annoying to try to get the handle of some of his attacks, especially with the controls being new to you and getting the handle of it. And since there's no health bar, it is kind of a slow and boring battle. It just kind of sucks that the pirates were done dirty, because that's how I feel about most of them in video games, and this one is no exception. It just feels like a slog, and it's a shame that Woofley just goes out in such a pitiful way, because he is one of the more better characters in the series, but honestly, I kind of wish he wasn't the end boss of the episode. Damn shame too, because the pirates definitely got the worst end when it came to this whole entire level, and this whole entire episode in particular.
Yeah, well, if there's anything like the rest of you, I think I'll manage.
Now we're getting into bosses that I really dislike the most. And one of the biggest offenders from Sly 3 is when it came to the mutant fights at the end of Honor Among Thieves. The mutant bosses aren't anything too noteworthy for certain, but then there came the sea monster. This boss blows. Not only does reaching to this frickin' boss become a hassle because you have to avoid all the various traps throughout this entire whirlwind segment, and it would risk you being low health, meaning you have to get yourself killed. But luckily you do get a checkpoint. However, the actual fight is where it gets worse. The deal with this sea monster is that it shoots out these buzz blades that explode in a shockwave blast depending on which angle they're facing. Whether they're going to be facing on the sides, you have to dodge up or down, or dodge left and right. Seems simple enough. Well, it would be, but the monster will also inhale you in, which is pretty easy to do. You just gotta make sure to aim at Dr. M, or else you will get chomped. But the worst of it is when the tentacles come out, and these are a nuisance to avoid, combined with that frickin' shockwave explosive attack, and you got yourself a pain of misery. The last phase isn't anything noteworthy, but now, on paper, this fight seems simple, so why am I making a big fuss out of all of his attacks and what he's doing? Well, here's the kicker. Dimitri's controls suck ass. To control Dimitri in these underwater segments, you have to use the buttons. Not the joystick, the buttons. Why couldn't we just use the D-pad as well? It would have made things more tolerable. It doesn't help the fact that you do have to go through that stupid track segment and trying to avoid all these attacks which risk you dying. A fight that seems like it would have been fine, but gets ruined because of bad controls or annoying difficulty. Sheesh. Almost reminds me of a certain boss where we play on challenge mode and nope! Not gonna talk about him. Not gonna talk about that little gremlin. Let's move on before he actually comes back again and haunts me.
Yeah, well, if he's anything like the rest of you, I think I'll manage.
I've talked about the best of the final bosses from the Sly Cooper series, but now it's time to start off with the worst final bosses from the series. And one of those two being Clockla from Sly 2. I know Sly 2 is a fan favorite, but they really end this fan favorite game on such a low note with Clockla. First off, what's the deal with this whole entire segment? Well, the betrayal scene with Neela just kind of confused me at certain points. To me, she's not a terrible villain by any means, but my problem with the betrayal is the fact that she backstabs everyone and wants to be a part of the Clockwork Frame for some reason. It doesn't get explained why, how, or why she wanted this whole entire immortality, considering she has like no beef or backstory behind her that explains anything. Especially betraying Arpeggio, which by the way, he kinda exists, and we get the whole Clockla treatment. But even with that backstory aside, the actual fight isn't even that good. For starters, the first phase is a turret section. Seriously? This is the best way we can start off a final boss? A turret section? I do not like turret sections in most games, but this turret section can either be really annoying or really boring. You have to shoot at the projectiles that Clockwork will send at you, somehow, such as missiles and the rings. You have to shoot the inner rings to make sure to not get electrified. She also sent out a projectile attack, which you have to shoot multiple times to prevent that from happening, but it's kind of annoying to do that when she's sending out a bunch of attacks at the exact same time. This is just a total snore fest and an annoyance of a turret section, and you can only win if you hopefully manage to land some hits on her to prevent any projectiles from coming after you. Then there's the rest of the fight, which is just boring platforming segments 101, hop around the wings and smack her in the face a bunch of times while she shoots a projectile that will never ever hit you. Then you get to the last segment and you have to pry open that bake with Murray, then blow up the traps with the bombs, grab the hate chip, and that's it. That's the whole fight. I can kind of read your boredom behind the screen, and I don't blame you because that's the whole entire fight. It's just a literal snore fest, and it feels so dull, especially for a final boss. To me, this whole entire finale just feels empty. Considering the final level itself wasn't even that good, this final boss was a total yawn fest, and the ending itself just made me feel a bit empty inside, especially with how it goes out. It's sad to see how this is how Clockwork goes out entirely. Just a pitiful waste.
Yeah, well, if he's anything like the rest of you, I think I'll manage.
Possessed Carmelita. This is easily, in my opinion, the worst boss fight from Sly 3. It barely felt like a boss fight. Doesn't help the fact that Dark Mask Earth, whatever its name is also one of the worst antagonists in the entire series. First off, it's just a generic looking mask. It has no personality, no backstory, barely any purpose to exist in this chapter as the actual main villain, considering the miners don't have an actual leader leading them or even an actual antagonist. The best they can resort to is just a flimsy mask. Already it paints a stain on one of my least favorite episodes, especially since the mask is fought twice, taking possession of a standard enemy and making him big, and taking possession of Carmelita. And where do I begin with the Carmelita segment? Well, in the first phase, you have to shoot her with sleeping darts while she chases Sly around. This is annoying to do because she is constantly moving and the sleeping darts travel so slow they have to wait until she stands still, hopefully, to actually shoot her with a sleeping dart. But you also have to be careful and look out for her because she'll have a chance of shooting at you if you hit her with a sleeping dart. So you have to keep mindful of your surrounding. But things don't get any better with the later phases, especially since the sleeping darts make her big for some reason. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. So Giant Fox chase after you, and the second phase is not even that good. The deal with the second phase is you have to throw the barrels that she throws on the truck back at her to do damage. Doesn't help the fact that the crane controls are bad on their own, and the barrels, you'll barely have any chances of yeeting them at her because of how many times she wants to hang around the sides, meaning you'll miss rather than hit her. And you have to be sure to throw the barrels off very quickly as they can damage the truck, thus causing you a loss. So yeah, second phase isn't good. The last segment isn't even any better, as it's complete nonsense. You have to climb up on top of Carmelita.
Context, honey.
And make your way to her mask and make her slap the mask off her face. Repeat the process 2 times, well, 1 time, in order to win. Yep, that's all you do. It just feels nonsensical and not really that fun to climb up on top of a fox and trying to get her to smack the mask off. Even the death of the mask makes no sense. It just gets shot at by a bunch of guards and everyone dies. The end. Yep. What a pitiful waste of time. This fight is nothing. It sucks.
Yeah, well, if he's anything like the rest of you, I think I'll manage.
So you might be wondering where Sly 1 has been. Well, apparently at the number 2 spot. And the only boss from the game that I actually didn't like is Ms. Ruby. Where do I even begin with Ms. Ruby? She's one of the most mixed bosses amongst the community. Many people do like this fight, and others hate her. And considering what list we're talking about, yep, I don't like Miss Ruby in the slightest. And it's not just her boss fight, I really don't like her as a character in the slightest. Out of all the members of the Fiendish 5, she's one of the 2 members that is my least favorite. In terms of her backstory, Miss Ruby was turned away by many people. They were afraid of her because she had a fascination of talking to the dead. So she took it upon an act of using it for crime. To me, the backstory just didn't really make any sense to me. It's not really that interesting and it doesn't make me feel bad for her. If she didn't want to be alone, how about not talk to the dead? I really wasn't a huge fan of the backstory. Even judging by her personality, she's boring. Even with her slow talking dialogue, it just makes me fall asleep. But then there's the actual fight against Miss Ruby. What's the deal with it? Well, it's literally a QTE Simon Says. You have to dodge the attacks at the correct timing to avoid getting hit. Sounds simple, right? Well, here's the catch. This battle is 3 phases of this QTE nonsense, and each phase gets either progressively faster or progressively slower depending on which part you are at. And here's where I grew to dislike the fight. But to everyone else, why they dislike it is because of a couple issues. First off, the actual gimmick of the fight. You have to follow in sync with the music in order to avoid these attacks. I played the original Sly 1 on the PlayStation 2, and everyone else that experienced this game on the HD remake knows that the music is desynced from the fight, meaning you'll get screwed over by the rhythm of the beat and thus causing you to die. And I can see that issue, despite not playing it on the HD. But even with the original game, I just suffer with input delays most of the time, and it causes me deaths. Doesn't help the fact that you have to restart at the beginning if you die, and the gimmick itself is just really boring and basic. It's just a boring QTE. I just don't see why people like it. It doesn't make it fun when it's a drag and a slog to go through, especially with the fight itself. The only good thing about it is the music, but even then that doesn't really make the mood less soury than it needs to be. Overall, it's easily one of my least favorite bosses in the entire series, and one that I always never look forward to when I replay Sly 1. And yet, she manages to avoid being the worst of the bunch. And you can already take a guess who is the number 1 worst.
Yeah, well, if he's anything like the rest of you, I think I'll manage.
Let's not beat around the bush. We already know who's the absolute worst boss in the entire franchise. The number 1 biggest shit stain of the series goes to Sorella Paradox from Sly 4. I don't know what they were thinking! Not only is La Paradox one of the worst antagonists in the entire series, being such a generic and lame villain in terms of his design, personality, and backstory, as I ranted about in the worst villains list, he really stinks like a skunk. He fails at being an actual villain since he barely has any screen time. His friends did all the real work of getting all the canes. He exposed out his whole entire cover because of his inflated ego, which he'd had no beef with Sly, but he just felt like going after the Cooper gang just so he can prove to the world he's the greatest thief of all time. It's lame. And what makes it even worse is his miserable shit stain of a boss battle. It's barely a fight since it's just QTEs throughout all 3 phases of the battle. You're just pressing, mashing buttons, doing a bit of platforming, mashing buttons, doing platforming, and repeating until you win. This barely feels like a battle. It's so empty and hollow. But here's the kicker on why La Paradox takes the number 1 as the worst. He's the 4th game's final boss. Yep, not only is La Paradox the worst boss fight in the entire series, but one of the worst final bosses I've ever faced. It's so miserable how they ended the 4th game on such a low note, especially compared to all the other bosses prior. Like, what the hell? Thing is, Santaru had plans for this fight, and they wanted to do a bit more, but they couldn't. Instead, this is the end result we get. But why didn't they make this an actual fight? Why couldn't they make it to where we control Sly and actually fight him instead of pressing buttons if they couldn't make it a grand scale final boss fight? Similar to a Flea, but better. They could have done a bit more instead of resulting to just this, especially since other games had sword fighting final bosses that were done before and after. And it's miserable to see the fourth game end on such a low note, especially with its cliffhanger. And the final level was going pretty solid. But, as it stands, the Paradox fucking stinks. It's no wonder why he's a skunk. Worthless antagonist ever. It's a shame Zemsru had to take the worst of the bunch.